Hello again, everybody. It's been a hot minute, right? But we are ready to start with our first session, our opening keynote for today. And we're starting with a good one, I can tell you. So our first keynote for today, he is the founder of FeverBee and the author of both Buzzing Communities and the Indispensable Community. Over the past 13 years, he has helped over 290 organizations, including Apple, Facebook, Google, the World Bank, to name a few. Through his Community Management Academy, he has also trained 1,250 of the world's top community pros. Today, he'll be helping you uncover metrics which really matter. Stop working on low-value tasks and tell a compelling community story. Please give a big CM Expert welcome to Rich Millington.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. All right, let me quickly share my screen and we should be good to go live. Okay, so I think it'll take around 20 seconds or so for my screen to go live. So hello, everyone. Welcome. And thank you so much for having me at this event as well. I know it's been a long year since we had a chance for me to speak at CMS, so I'm so excited to have this opportunity today. What I'm going to be talking about today is how we take all the volume of data and information that we have and turn it into insights that we can use within our communities. Insights that we can use to ruthlessly decide what to prioritize within our community today. I think at the moment, there's a huge disconnect here. There's a huge disconnect between all this data that we're collecting and the really valuable insights that we get at the end. And what I want to do today is turn that data into actions, to harness all these insights, all this data we're getting into clear and specific things that we can do to change how we manage our communities, to improve our communities, to always make sure that we're developing the best communities we possibly can. Because what I've seen time and time again, with all the clients I've been working with over the last decade, with all of the people that have gone through our training courses, is that we spend far too much time working on the wrong things. We spend far too much time working on these low priority tasks. We spend far too much time on things that feel like they're very important, but maybe just merely keep the community ticking over, instead of fundamentally taking the community to the level where it needs to be. When we begin working with a client, one of the first things I always try to ask the community manager or the community team to do is simply make a list of what they're working on any given week. And what we find time and time again is that when they make a list, not only are we shocked by how many things that they're working on, but they're shocked by how many things they're working on. When they start making a list of all the things that they're working on any given week, they often find that they're working on maybe 20 things, maybe 30 things. The record was 41 things in a given week. With a project we were working on a couple of years ago, this is what we had. When she made a list, when the community manager of this community made a list of all the things that she's working on in this week, it's incredible. She's replying to discussions every day. She's contacting product experts and getting them to respond to questions. She's trying to nurture all of the subgroups within the community. She's recruiting and managing the super users. She's writing a weekly newsletter. She's trying to run these regular AMAs, record and edit a podcast, respond to questions and DMs from members. She's trying to write announcements and product posts and facilitate these big giveaway events. She's hosting a weekly Work It Out Loud discussion. She's creating monthly reports of updated metrics. She's responding to all of the product ideas and feedback within the community. She's welcoming newcomers. She's attending internal meetings. She's working on translation tools. She's attending meetings with the platform vendor to resolve those issues. She's attending community management webinars to learn new skills and reviewing spam content and helping moderate the community. It is quite simply impossible to do really great work when you're dividing your time into smaller and smaller chunks. And one of the things that we always try to do with any community team we work with is to narrow down what they're doing to a couple of things that really matter. Because when your calendar is packed like this, you simply don't have time to do great work. And it's really difficult to improve the community in any metric when you're so busy putting out all the fires, when you're so busy continuing what you're doing last week. And what our mission is with so many of these communities, and what I really want to talk about today, is how we get this right, how we use the data we have to prioritize what we're doing. Imagine, for example, you're measured by the satisfaction of members in your community. Imagine it's a simple scale of 1 to 5, asking members when they visit, asking visitors when they visit, how satisfied they are with the community today. When this community manager went on holiday, she wasn't replaced, and we got to see what the impact was during that time. And if you were to look at this this slide here, when do you think she went away? Take a second and think, what month did she go away? And I'm guessing that you didn't guess here. I'm guessing that it wasn't around April 2018. And the incredible thing here is that when she went away for a month, wasn't covered, we actually got to see in real time whether there'd be a massive decline in the metrics or not. And the answer was that there wasn't. It means that there was huge opportunity to improve the community, because clearly a lot of the tasks that she's working on weren't as essential to improving the critical metric that they wanted to move. And this also presented a tremendous opportunity for us to learn and improve the community. Imagine, for example, that this is where you're at today, and you had a graph that looked like this of how satisfied your members were in your community, and your boss came into you and said, we want this number to go up. What would you do? What would you work on? What would be the priority for you to increase this metric at the moment? The challenge with a question like this is that there's so many different things that you can work on. You could improve the website. You could recruit more super users into the community. You could host more events, publish more content. You could increase the rewards of the gamification program, nurture more subgroups, engage more staff in the community, more moderators in the community. There's so many things that you can do. And what we really try to do is zero in on the very specific things that actually matter. And what I want to take you through today is an example of how we've done that with a client. And hopefully you can take parts of this and apply it to your situation as well. Because the ability to do this is such an important tool in our work. And the ability to use data to guide everything we do is critically important to the success of our communities. So the first step is to decide what impacts the metrics you really care about. And you'll notice in a lot of these slides, I have this kind of tagline at the bottom, which is it's probably not what you think. In almost every client project I've worked with, people think they know what impacts a metric, but their data often says something completely different. So the first thing we did with this client was we did a survey, looking at what do members actually care about in the community. And what we found is that it's pretty clear that most members care about getting help from others. When we looked at the data, we found that most members care about getting help from others. And this is really common. What's also interesting here is that very often the things that we think matter, the things that we think are going to have a big impact, don't. And it's often really hard to simply accept the data you're getting. So the first thing you try to do is a survey and find out which parts of the community, which parts of the product, which parts of the features that are available do members actually care about? How important are they? And in this case, it's very clear what members care about. And there's also a bigger discussion here, because what we're seeing in most of the communities that we've worked with is that most people just want good information that's relevant to them right now. Yes, we can talk a lot about belonging, and I've got a debate with David Spinks about that in a week or so. But what we found in almost every survey we've done, every piece of data we've collected, is that most people just want good information that's relevant to them. And so the challenge is first putting in place a metric that lets you track this. Because once you have that metric in place, once you have a means or tool of measuring this, you can then figure out how you can increase that metric. So if we know that helpfulness or satisfaction is what we're tracking, is what matters to us, then we can figure out what kind of tools can we use to measure that. The Fitbit community, for example, have a regular poll when you visit the site, or have this pop up after a certain amount of time. And then you can go through and tell them how satisfied you are, or what you think of the community, and answer a few simple questions. The Microsoft community has a very simple measure where they look at how helpful the individual responses are. And if you click on yes or no, then it asks you specifically how satisfied you are with each reply as well. And this gives them great data. Another way is to have a bar at the top of the page that is always there, asking people how helpful they found the community today, or how satisfied are with the community today. But what you need to begin with is some single metric that you can track. And this should be a metric that is on a daily basis. It's sure if you have a low volume community, then a monthly feedback metric is good, but I really love getting real-time feedback. So when you make any change whatsoever, you can very quickly see what moves the metric and what really matters and what doesn't. So step one is to figure out what is the metric that matters most to your members. And in this case, it was how helpful they found the community. Then figure out a way of measuring that. Polls and surveys work well. If it's an engagement measure, that'll be something else. But figure out what is the best means of measuring that. Step two is to determine what is going to impact that metric. If we know what members care about, then the next thing is to figure out what actually impacts that metric. And here, the easiest place to begin is what are we working on today? What are all the things the community manager is doing today? And what happens when we stop doing some of those things? So one way of thinking about all of the work you're doing today is to put it into a framework just like this. So what we see, there are tasks that you're working on that have a long-term impact and some that have a short-term impact. And then there are things that reach a big percentage of the audience of that community. And then there are things that reach a small percentage of that community. And what we try to do with the clients and the community managers we work with is start figuring out which of their tasks fit into which of these boxes today. So a very rough guide, we might have replying to emails and discussions. It doesn't really have a long-term impact and it reaches a small audience. So that will go in the bottom left here. The super user campaigns and those activities reach a relatively small audience, at least in terms of the super users, although that will have a bigger impact longer down the line. But the long-term impact upon this audience is quite significant. Then the top left, we're looking at content and events. Things that tend to reach a big audience, but the impact isn't huge. You usually attend the content, you usually attend the event, so you read that content, and then you're kind of done. And then finally, you have the things that reach a big audience and have a long-term impact. And there's lots of things that fit into this category here, but website changes are the most common. And what we find when we have a framework like this, we find that people that aren't highly performing in communities spend way too much time in that bottom left box. They spend way too much time replying to emails and discussions, and they're doing things that make them feel like they're really, really busy, but none of those things they're doing have a long-term impact upon the community. And they notice that they feel quite good about doing them because they get the thanks and the gratitude from each individual member, but they're not working on things that are going to make those activities happen just by themselves. And then we find there are things that are quite fun to do. The super user campaigns are usually the most fun activities for community professionals to work on. People tend to love doing these things. They get the feedback, they get the responses, they get to build that genuine sense of community. And then there are things that are quite time intensive for a short amount of time, such as content and events. And then there's the things that are resource intensive and require most time and resources and effort and energy to implement. And what we try to do is cut back things on that bottom left to free up the time that we have for the other activities that are going to have the most success over the long term. So looking at the community manager we're working with in this situation, the very first step we did, the very first thing we do is to cut back on activities to see what actually matters to members. When we start cutting back on what the community manager is working on today, we get to see what really impacts that metric. So if we were to put a framework of the things that the community manager was working on from before, we can start seeing, okay, the working out loud discussions, we noticed that there was some participation, but it's from a very relatively small group, and it was declining over time. So the first thing we did was we got rid of that. Next, we started looking at the weekly newsletter. This was a target because the community manager was spending a lot of time working on this. It was a couple of hours a week to put together the snippets, the information, the design, and we're looking at the open rates, we're looking at the click-through rates, and it wasn't really getting a high number of click-throughs, which suggests we can probably get rid of that. And then the podcast. Generally speaking, I don't think most communities should have podcasts at the moment. I don't think it adds enough to the discussion. It doesn't add enough to the value of the community. Members weren't really requesting it. There weren't that many reviews. There wasn't any signal that the podcast was that popular. So then we got rid of that. Then we began looking at the subgroups. Most of the subgroups, no matter what the community manager was doing, simply weren't taken off. So we archived a large number of those groups as well. And then we looked at the weekly AMA, where we get a top expert in, they would interview that expert live. It wasn't a huge amount of time, but it's a couple of hours a week. Again, it had some activity, but it was declining over time. I think they'd gotten through most of the top experts quite quickly. And so we got rid of that as well. And what we found, just by doing these things, that we saved around 60% of the community team time, simply by implementing these changes. And then we got to see what the impact was. If we had the member satisfaction here and the unique visitors here as well, then we can start seeing, once we stop doing most of the things the community team was doing, what is the impact? And we found, before we arrived, a big giveaway, having a big spike of activity. But when we removed a couple of things, the expert interviews, the newsletter, a lot of the groups, the podcast, and a few of the profile options as well, we found that actually the satisfaction of members in the community didn't plummet, actually went up. And so this was interesting. It suggests that we can stop doing a lot of things that we were doing, and members don't really care. And this frees up a lot of time to use the insights that we're getting to decide what to prioritize next. What do we want to spend even more of our time doing? And here we look at a couple of things. The first thing is to do a survey to figure out what members really care about. And then we do interviews to take a really deep dive into what members need, the format and the specifics of that. Surveys are really great. They're great for developing unique segments of the audience, finding out who the demographics of your audience are, building out the unique personas. They're great for identifying what issues members care about the most. And it's great for building out a certain set of assumptions about what really matters to your members. And then this, by the way, you can get a survey template at cmx.feverbee.com that we use. But surveys are great. They really help you figure out, what do members find helpful? If we know from the very beginning that what members most want from a community is to get help, then we can figure out what specifically do members find helpful in a community. So the next step was to do this survey. And these were the results. What do you notice about this? Is that it's clear from the results. What members cared about most was getting a response from a staff member and getting a good response. And like great data, this confounded our expectations. Before we did this survey, I thought what members would care about the most was the speed of response from a member like themselves that is written in a kind and empathetic way. This simply isn't what the data says. It's often very hard just to simply accept the data that we're getting, because we often want a community to behave and feel like a certain thing. So following the data is really important. So we looked at response from a staff member was very important, and the quality of response was really important as well. And things that we might have felt were important, like the kind and the sympathetic response written with empathy, was nowhere near as high as what we thought. And the speed of response wasn't the critical thing, where it often is in other projects we've worked on. So this tells us specifically some of the things we have to be focusing on when we're going to be improving this community. But the survey data is good, but we also want to take a deeper dive with the interviews with members as well. Interviews are fantastic. They're great for diving into the specifics of what members want, uncovering precisely what they need and what they respond to. A few years ago, I was working with a community of sales professionals. And what the survey results showed is that members wanted templates and resources more than anything else. They wanted great templates and resources from their peers, people exactly like themselves. But when we started looking at the interviews, when we began asking members specifically what kind of resources they want, what kind of templates they wanted, we found they wanted great templates on how testimonials are done. We found they wanted great templates on the sales presentations. They really wanted the specifics of those exact templates and resources that people are using. So the interviews uncovered precisely what members wanted within that community. And once we have that, we can work with members to develop precisely those things. So we did the interviews next. I think we did around 17 interviews for this client. And the interviews showed a very clear set of problems and a very clear set of desires that members wanted as well. The problems were quite specific. One, members were telling us the community was very hard to navigate. They're saying that the search didn't reveal good, accurate results. They were saying that they were landing at old posts with outdated information. They were showing that a lot of the information they wanted was scattered around several different parts of the website. And they were saying that a lot of the members were not being seen as the expert. They wanted to be, they were concerned that if they asked a question in the community, they were someone that was supposed to be an expert within their organization, and they're worried how it would look if other people from their organization saw their questions and suddenly thought that they might not be the expert that they were presumed to be. So we had a clear set of problems, and then we began looking at the desires. What do members actually want in their community? Where do they want to be? And then there's often an opposite here. The problems are on desires and it's put in a different way. But we found they wanted detailed resources, which were really easy to find. We found they wanted more participation from staff members, backing up the survey results we had. We found that they wanted an answer to the question that was within the response, not just a link directing them somewhere else where they had to go. They wanted responses from people like themselves. And they wanted all the outdated information to basically just disappear. Archive was a word that we put in, but it's pretty clear that there's a very clear set of problems and a very clear set of desires. And now once we have this, once we have the survey data, once we have that interview information, then we can do really specific things to improve the community. One of the very first things we did was start developing these detailed resources. We started taking a particular problem or an issue they had and developing a resource that would include both the product information, the questions that people were asking, the relevant links, all into one place. An organization that does this extremely well is DigitalOcean. If you look at the DigitalOcean online community, what you find is that they spend so much time developing these definitive resources, both from themselves and on behalf of members, and they are fantastic. And so what we began doing with the client is developing a series of definitive resources just like this. Definitive resources are a really good idea, is that they don't get the same bump in engagement and activity as what you do from many other activities, but over time, they really have a big impact. I was having a debate with a client about this because very often there was a decision about whether to invest time and resources in a VIP webinar or investing that time in a product resource. And what we found is that a VIP webinar, when we hosted this, it got a huge amount of traffic. More people were arriving at that page from all the promotion that we were doing. But the product resource, if you look at it over time, if you look at the traffic that a definitive resource gets over time and drives to a community, over the long term, it has a far bigger impact. And when you begin tracking the overall number of visits to a community over the long term, we find that it's not even close. It definitely takes time. But if you continually update the resources, the resource that you create, if you make sure it's relevant, if you make sure it's optimized for search, over the long term, it will drive far more traffic. And when you have not just one resource, but start developing several definitive resources, especially things like 101 guides that attract people that are new to the topic, especially things like product and equipment guides or setup and configuration guides, there's lots of things like this that tend to be very popular in most communities. And if you can create this kind of content, it tends to drive a lot more traffic over the long term. So we spent a lot of time developing these definitive resources. The next step was to archive discussions in the community. We found that the community had a lot of outdated discussions that were getting very low visits, that weren't getting that many posts in the community. So we took a very simple approach to doing this. One is that any discussion that had less than 10 visits in the past month or 2 posts in the past year, this was removed. But the challenge with removing posts is that in many platforms, you can also remove the post count or members and the gamification, the levels and the point systems and all those kind of things. So what we instead did is make sure that members kept those points and we removed these kind of discussions and archived them and made sure they didn't appear in search results. And we also found as a result of this, search traffic did increase. So we made these few interventions that were relatively simple to make, but it's very much the low-hanging fruit. And you can see here what the impact of that is. You can see what happens when we remove the initial bunch of activity, and you can see that low-hanging fruit over here. You can see that when we made these changes, the satisfaction of members increased even more within that community. So the next step is, okay, we've removed to free up time. We've had the low-hanging fruit, the things that we can target very easily, that have the biggest bang for buck in the short term. Then we wanted to go to the next level. And this is where we started looking at a deeper dive of the community. What we find in many communities is that they have many groups that are sometimes active and inactive. And if you were to look at any kind of community, like the Sephora community, not the example of this client, but definitely a client we've worked with in the past, you'll find that some groups are very highly active, some groups need a little more activity, and some groups simply should be removed. So when we're looking at the client we're working with, we made a very simple rule here, which is we're going to remove any community that hadn't received 10 posts in the past month and wasn't in what we would describe as a protected or special category that was important. And these were often categories that were related to product announcements, related to diversity, or related to language. So we removed these groups or merged them with existing groups. So any group that was there had a good level of activity, and you're never going to join a group that simply wasn't taken off, that wasn't developing there. The next thing we looked at was search. What we find with a lot of the communities we've worked with is that the search tool doesn't function anywhere near the level it should. So we added in a cognitive search tool. And if you haven't used a cognitive search tool before, it looks a little bit like this, where it can retrieve information from anywhere, the way that a federated search tool does, where it can retrieve information from your knowledge base, from the community, and it can show up all these discussions and answers alongside each other. But what it can also do is a pattern match based upon similar results that other members have wanted, based on what their members like you have done before, and can show you the most relevant results to you. The challenge with any cognitive search tool is that it's not cheap. I think Coveo, what we used in this example, was around 40 grand to begin with. So that's 40 grand a year. So it's expensive and not worth doing if you have a low volume community. But if you have a high volume community, it can really, really help. So it can display the most relevant information from both inside the community and outside of the community. And this, in a single stroke, solves all of the search issues that we were having. Well, most of the search issues, not 100%, but most of the search issues. If you go to the Logitech community, you can see an example of what a typical good implementation of search looks like. Then we looked at the taxonomy and the structure of the community itself. What you find, if you look at the website of any community, there's so many different ways you can categorize that community. You can optimize for different groups and targets and product groups. You can do it by user type. You can segment your community by who those members are. Things like, are they a customer? Are they a developer? Are they a partner? Or are they a reseller? You can look at the product categories as well. You can look at by product 1, 2, or 3, a very simple way. You can look at what sector. Is it retail? Is it B2B? Or more interestingly, you can look at the visiting intent. Do people join the community because they want to collaborate, share, and get help? And we found this client, a lot of what they're doing was by visiting intent. When people would visit the community, they would have options in how they wanted to engage by the visiting intent. They want to collaborate or share or do something that was more about the intent of when they were coming there. And what we found is that when you look at the examples of this, there's clearly some that seem to work better than others. If you look at the Clouds community, also a past client of ours, they do it by intent. If you look at the Dropbox community, it's kind of by intent there. And if you look at the Fitbit community, they do it by the product. And having worked with numerous communities over the last decade, what we've typically found is that by product seems to be the most intuitive approach. It would be great if it did work by the intent. That'd be the ideal thing because you can do lots of amazing things based upon that. What we've typically found the most effective approach is to do it by the type of product that people are interested in, because people naturally seem to want help with a very specific category. They know what to search for. It won't work well for all communities, but we found that by products seems to be the best approach. And then we began reviewing the search results, figuring out what were the most popular areas and prioritizing those areas in the community. We made sure that everything was a maximum of 3 clicks deep. We've removed all of the thematic categories and the visiting intent paths. We found that even though we would love the intent to work and people would naturally go to places where they can collaborate with each other, where they can naturally share their ideas and expertise, members simply weren't navigating the community that way. We looked at, there was a tool we used. I think it was Crazy Egg, one of those research path tools. Maybe someone can put it in the comments. And we looked to see what people were actually clicking on and how they were navigating through the community. And what we found time and time again is that they were looking for a product, they were looking at information that way. So we moved all of the visiting intent paths. Then we focused on product types and the user types as well, because not everyone was looking for product help. Some of them were developers, some of them partners, and they most naturally gravitated towards those kind of areas. When we began implementing all these changes, or what we call some of the big wins, we found again there was an increase in the satisfaction of members in that community. It wasn't huge, but I think a lot of these things tend to take off over time. So we added cognitive search, we allowed members to post with a pseudonym as well. This I don't think had a big impact, but it might have had some. We revamped the taxonomy and navigation. And we also created the direct to engineers section, where if you had a very particular, I'm trying not to reveal who the client is, but you had a very particular issue, you could contact the engineers directly for that issue. It was one of those topics where a member wouldn't naturally be able to help. So we wanted to get people help a lot quicker. And again, we found the level of satisfaction from implementing these things increased. So I think most of us, looking at the data we have, looking at the tools we have, should be able to get to this level where we can take a community that has been in a slight decline in the satisfaction or whatever metric matters to you, look at the data, free up some space from what we're doing now, tackle the low-hanging fruit, and then implement some big wins. But we don't want to stop here. We also want to go to the next level beyond this, which is what we'll call step 4, which is taking a much deeper dive into the data that you have in your community to optimize your community. And again, you'll notice that tag at the bottom. It's probably not what you think. One of the things I think we had around January 2019 is that the helpfulness score on a scale of 1 to 5 was 4.1. And the challenge is, what does 4.1 mean to you? What does 4.1 mean? It's a surface level metric. It doesn't tell you too much. It's not that helpful. It doesn't reveal what's going on within the community. It's a balance sheet that simply tells you how your community is doing today. And where it gets really interesting is when you start exploring beneath the surface of the data. So 4.1 isn't a number that occurs by chance. There are lots of different factors that lead into that. And when you start going beneath the surface of your data and really start exploring in the weeds that, you can see how you can take a simple satisfaction score, a helpfulness score, an engagement score, and start breaking it down by different categories and activities you're doing and find out what really contributes to that. And my favorite tool for this was called a bubble graph or a bubble chart. And it looks like this. You can take your community and break it down by the unique categories or features that are in there and start comparing things in this kind of graph. And my favorite way of doing it is looking at the response rate, looking at the average time to first response, looking at the size of the community, and looking at the helpfulness of that community as well. And when you get all these 4 data points together, it gives you incredibly rich and useful information about what's not working and what is working. And it's very clearly looking at this, that certain products are doing better than others. Not everything is even. There's not just one score anymore. We can pull it apart and look very specifically at what kind of interventions we might want to make at different levels here. And when you start looking at this, what occurs to you? What kind of things would you be looking at? What would you be looking to improve there? So what we did is first is that this product 2, this category of discussions here, clearly the average time to first response is nowhere near good enough. And there's no reason behind that, except for these questions seem to be a little bit more difficult and less people had the answers to do that. So our first goal here was to reduce the time to first response by assigning virtual agents that could help here. Next, we looked at the product 1 category. Well, even though it was doing okay, the response rate could be a lot higher. So we tried to improve that by making sure that if you ask a question in this category, those questions would appear in a more visible place on the homepage of that community. And we also assigned more virtual agents to help. So if you didn't get a response, then a staff member would jump in within a certain amount of time to make sure you did get a response to that question. Virtual agents or staff can be great helping in the community as long as they're filling in the gaps and not leading the charge. And then we looked at the partners and developers who clearly weren't having a good experience in that community. And we tried to recruit specific experts to answer questions alongside staff members as well, trying to improve the helpfulness score. To be honest, this didn't improve it too much, but definitely for product 2 and product 1, we did get the results that we wanted. So there's very specific things when you pull a community apart into the different metrics and the different categories that are out there. There are very specific things that you can improve there. Then we looked at the super users as well. One of the things about super user campaigns is that people never tend to measure them in a way you might think. They measure them again by that surface level score, that 4.1, or the number of posts, or the response rate, or the accepted solution rate, but they never go beneath the surface to explore how each of the super users are doing. And you can use this same technique as before to measure this. Because I know from time and time again is that some users are really good, some super users are really good. They respond to every question, they do it in an extremely good way. Some just respond to a lot of questions, but the actual outcome of those responses aren't that good. So we began breaking down the performance of the super users by how each of them was performing. And you notice here, we had to remove the names obviously, but you notice here how different this is. You can see the helpfulness score in terms of people that were visiting on that question and were getting the survey or the poll response there compared to others. And you can see that some super users here clearly weren't doing as well as what they should be doing. In fact, some were doing more harm than good. And worse than that, some of the most active and engaged super users we had weren't actually delivering good responses. So we took a 3-pronged approach to resolving this. First, any super user that was scoring below 3, when we relaunched this program, they weren't re-invited back to participate in it. This had a very, this provoked a very negative reaction from these members, but honestly, I think it was the right thing to do. Then we began looking at this group. Those that scored between, was it 3 and up to 3.75, I think, somewhere around that level, below average. We did 2 things here. One is that we created a basic training course to go through. This was around 30 slides or so. And what it primarily did is that it took the best responses from the other super users that were out there, and then highlighted how they can improve their own responses. Most were generally quite receptive to that. And the other thing we did is that we let super users see their ranking. Not just their ranking in terms of number of posts that they responded to or the things that we typically optimize for. We let them see their monthly ranking exactly like this. We could see how they compared to other super users within the community, particularly in the helpfulness score. And we found when we did this, the helpfulness of all the super users increased. There's definitely a sense of competition about these things. And what we also found with the top super users here, when the bottom group stopped jumping in to reply to every question, this group had more questions that they could respond to. And we found that bad super users would often respond to lots of questions, and that deterred good super users from jumping in because the question already had an answer. So when we implemented these specific things, we immediately saw a big impact in terms of the level of activity. They had more opportunity to jump in and be involved. So when we start looking at the optimized level, when we assign agents to help with the product 2 category, when we reposition the product 1 questions for better visibility response, when we recruited experts to answer those questions, we moved to super users, had that training course, and showed the super users their ranking. Again, we can see a huge impact here. And so I think you can see when you follow the data, when you really dive into the weeds of the data from the surveys, the interviews, the metrics you have, pulling apart the big metric into the sub things that contribute to it, you can come up with very specific things that are the best use of your time. You can take all the data you have and turn into great insight so you can use to improve your community. And when you have this, when you have a graph like this, tell your story really clearly. It drives me crazy how many people have amazing results and they don't tell your story in a very clear way. And one of the things you might notice that I've done throughout this whole presentation is try to tell it as a narrative and annotated graph just like this. And also, if we go back, the member satisfaction here, yes, it has increased, but it doesn't look like a huge change. If you look on the graph, it goes from what? When we began 3.75, around that level, up to around, at the peak, 4.75. it doesn't look huge. But when you do it as an absolute score, when you just focus on that metric, you can see actually when we were working with this client, we took it from one of the lowest scores they ever had to the highest score they ever had in a really short amount of time. And I think there's lots of ways to tell your community story. But one of the ways that we don't spend anywhere near enough time doing is an annotated graph like this. So people can see what you're doing and they can see what the result has been. So anytime you like, you can follow and track and share this with others so other people can see what the result of your work is. And if they care about this metric, then they can see how you've improved that metric. And you can come up with a very simple graph like this. I love sending this to other clients or prospective clients, showing them specifically when our consultancy began, when it ended, and what the clear result of that is. So don't just do the work, make sure you tell your story in a very easy to understand way. But ultimately, this whole presentation has been about using your data to develop insights. So plug that data into the insights that you need to get and to use it to change your actions, to use it to change your behavior, to use it to do everything you possibly can to build the best possible community you can for your members. A couple of things before I hand over back. I have a book that's coming out soon, my third book. I'm really excited about it. It's going to be the most tactical guide I've ever written to developing your online community. I really hope that if you like this presentation, that you check that out. It goes really deep into the weeds. I'm not pining upon the future of communities or any of those kind of things. It's going to be a very immediate, very tactical guide that anyone you're working with or you can use to develop your community to the highest possible level. So please do check that out. If you want to learn more about me, you can go to FeverBee.com, richard@feverbee.com. And yeah, you can discover more. You can get in touch with me. And I'm happy to share the slides and videos and any other information that you would like. Thank you so much for listening. It's always a tremendous honor to speak at CMX. I'm always amazed by the work that CMX does. And I'm always blown away by the work that everyone listening and watching is doing every single day. I think more than ever, our work matters. I think this work is going to be work that we should be proud of doing. And I really hope we can use our data to do it even better than we're doing today. I'm going to hand back to Valentina now. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, now's a good time to ask.
First of all, can we give a big round of applause to Rich Millington? Please let us know in the chat. It was a great start to CMX Spark. And we have a lot of questions, actually. So I'm going to bring up my iPad here, and I'm going to ask a few questions that people are interested to know. So we're going to start off with Nikki. She or he says, can you give an example of a super user campaign? And addition to that, how would you recommend starting to track data if the organization doesn't have a strong means of doing so?
Yeah, so the challenge with a lot of the work that I've been sharing is that it doesn't work in a Facebook group. If you've got a Facebook group or a simple platform, Tribe, Hive, Bright, those are great platforms to use, but it does limit your data. And so what I would do, even then, you can still do a survey that goes out once a month to your audience. You can still do an online poll. There's still plenty of things that you can do, even at that level, to get a lot of useful data in. You can still interview your members. So you can't do it in the automated way. It'll be more difficult to break down individual categories like that. But you can still go through the first few levels of that and build a much better community experience. You can still do those kind of things. In terms of super user campaigns, I mean, there's so many great ones that are out there today. Like Spotify do an amazing job. If you go to feverbee.com/communities, if you don't mind me plugging the website, you can find a list of my favorite super user programs that are out there today. Microsoft do a great job. SAP do a great job. Yeah, if you go to feverbee.com/communities, you can find an example there of my favorite super user campaigns.
Great. Next question then comes from Michael. He says, do you see an optimal time in a community's maturity to focus on big audience / long-term impact, or is this something we should be focused on right from the start?
I would focus on your data right from the start. The challenge is when you're it's not about the maturity of the community, it's about how much data you're getting and how you use that. The problem with very low data at the beginning is that it's very variable. So a few members here and there can shift the metrics in a wild way. So you might have to aggregate it over a longer period of time to see what the actual trends are. But I would definitely begin at the very beginning, like in terms of the survey results, in terms of finding out what members want, what they need. Honestly, before we do any client project whatsoever, we probably interview up to 20 to 30 prospective members of that community, and it takes a huge amount of time. But by the end of that, you have very clear personas. You know exactly what members want. You know exactly what kind of discussions they need. You know exactly what kind of outcome that they want from the community, what kind of content they need. You can do all these amazing things to generate those kinds of activities and make sure that members get precisely what they want.
Definitely. All right, we've got time for a few more questions. Esha says, what basic exercises / practices would you recommend to drive more engagement from the users?
I think engagement as its own reward is the wrong approach. There's lots of things you can drive more engagement. I think the problem is getting the right kind of quality engagement. So I don't like having engagement just as a goal. I don't ever think of engagement as the outcome of what we want at any particular time. What I do think about is how do we deliver the most value we possibly can? Because if you increase the value of that community, you naturally get more engagement. And so for me, it's not about some tips like, oh, host an event or a discussion or an activity. It's about, okay, if we ask 10 members of the community, what do you want? And then we see what's happening in the community. You can very clearly see, okay, this is what they want. It's either being delivered in the community or it's not. But then we can begin building from that. So what I like to do is build up a whole list of resources, discussions, problems that members are having, and then gradually resolving them in the community. Beginning with working with a very small group of confederates, as we call them, or founding members, getting those kind of responses first, and then building upon things from there. So I don't see engagement as a goal. I see engagement as an outcome of delivering great value from that community. And if you figure out what members value in the first place, it becomes a lot easier to deliver the results you want after that.
Yeah, no, definitely great tips there. Okay, we've got time for one more question, and we're going to go with a question from Rob. He says, what led to the decision to remove active but unhelpful super users rather than educate and give them a chance to improve?
In an ideal world, we would spend a lot of time with them to help them get up to the right level. Honestly, it was a judgment call. We looked at the tone of voice they were using. We looked at how well they'd engage with the super user team, and we decided whether they would be receptive to feedback or not. And sometimes, I hate to say it, it's just not worth the time. Sometimes it's easier to train up people that do want to do well and focus your time on them than try to accommodate everyone. And I think that's the challenge we often have in a community. It sounds always best to try and help as many people as you possibly can and deliver the best results you can for everyone. But sometimes you've got to focus on the members that want to be there, the members that have the most potential to improve. And that's what we decided to do there. So it's a judgment call. You have to use your experience and insights and what you think is going to be best for the entire community, not just a few individual members within the community.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. That's all we've got time for in terms of questions. Just once again, thank you so much, Rich. Please show him some support in the chat. It was great to have you opening our CMX Spark today. Thanks again, Rich.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.